Justin Carpenter.
All right. What's
How
up,
are you,
Kyle?
buddy? Good
I'm
to see
good,
you.
man. Yeah, good to see you too.
So here we have our attempt to do a Zoom discussion to
Hmm.
talk about what the heck is going on in the world. So um, this is my first chance to do an interview with someone. I've been interviewed for different, probably somewhat unrelated things over the years, but I'll kind of introduce myself, who I am, and then I'll ask you to introduce yourself. And then what we're going to do is just talk about some big topics. Today's the 7th of August, 2020. We're in the middle of an apparent pandemic. Some call it a plandemic. Yeah. And we are not, and I'll say this because we're on the same page about this, we are not coming at this from any sort of conspiracy theory sort of thing, which is it's such a weird term to even use, because
Hmm.
anyone with an inquiring mind is then called a conspiracy theorist.
Right.
What we are is we're trying to get to the truth. We're
Hmm.
seekers of the truth. And we met, was it last summer or the summer
Hmm.
before,
Last summer, yeah.
at Dimensions of Disclosure,
Hmm.
down in California, was it?
Ventura, California, yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, last year was a wild year for me. So
Hmm.
who am I? I'm Kyle Cheveldayoff. I live in Victoria, British Columbia. I'm a husband. I'm a father to an 8.5-month-old beautiful baby girl called Hope. I work as a psychologist. Previously, I was a firefighter in Calgary for 10 years. I was a physiotherapist before that. I was a kinesiologist before that. And I only say that because I have academia behind me. I've got 2 science degrees, then I've got a psychology degree. I can't even describe how many journal articles I've read over the years and delving into the peer-reviewed literature. So I'm not proposing to be anyone special in the world of academia, but I get research, and I get how the academic side of things works, and there's pros and cons to that. And so from my end, I'm coming at this as just just a dude trying to fumble through this world. I'm a seeker of the truth. I'm a very, very spiritual person. I don't resonate with any one religion. I think they're all wonderful if people look at it through a general sort of lens, that this is all about love, this is all about light. Or unless you're playing on the other side, then it's maybe about darkness and
Hmm.
manipulation. And we'll get into some of those discussions. But for me, something that really drives me, um, and an example of this is I've just recently, in the past few months, come out on Facebook as really giving my opinion about some things. I used to be really silent on Facebook, and oh, here's a fluffy photo, and here's a fluffy photo, and my life looks perfect. And now I've gone, you know what? I need to be a father. I need to be a human being that really cares about what's going on. And I don't want to look back in 10 years and have to answer to my daughter, Daddy, why were you so asleep? Daddy, why didn't you look into these things? Why did you drink the Kool-Aid and just believe the narratives that the mainstream media is feeding you? And so I've started looking into things, and it takes a lot of bloody time. I've talked with you quite a bit. We are not um, reading headlines and then putting that forward. We're reading articles. We're delving into the research. We're having
Hmm.
deep discussions. We're talking with a lot of people, and we're spending a lot of time trying to dig through this stuff to see what the truth is. And that's how you and I really aligned, is we're
Hmm.
both seekers of the truth from different angles, and from similar angles too. So who the heck's Justin Carpenter?
Yeah. Well, so I guess to give a kind of background of where I came from, I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, kind of lower, um, upper income kind of family. Went to a private school, really good education, really good family upbringing. A lot of I was very blessed. I am very blessed. Come from a very good family, very good house, and I came up through went to college, did the whole kind of like structured approach of what I thought, what I was told was the right way to go about it. So I went to college, got my industrial engineering degree, got a job right out of college, and sort of corporate life, and did that until I was almost 30 years old, moving from Tennessee to San Antonio to Seattle, And then I met you in California, kind of on at the verge of a transition from Seattle to where I'm at now, which has been sort of stepping into more of that. I stopped letting the world define me on how I should live, and started living more how I felt was right. And you mentioned it briefly, but I had a similar sort of experience where I was very silent. I spent a lot of time learning about things, and I've always fascinated with how the inner workings of the world operate. But I was always very quiet about it. It was, that
Mm.
sort of fear of public reaction,
Being
or fear.
judged and
Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
Fear of being ostracized for having
Hmm.
contradictory opinions. And so
Hmm.
I kept them to myself largely. But it was kind of, you know, meeting you in California at Dimensions of Disclosure was definitely a big catalyst for me for stepping off into that. Wow, there's a whole world out there, and there's a whole community of people who are willing to engage in that truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might seem.
Hmm.
And from that point, where we're at now, I've definitely taken that leap of faith off, and I'm posting and putting all sorts of things
Oh, you're
online.
living it. You're like a vagabond traveling across the USA
Right.
right now. It's
Yeah, and
amazing.
that's physically, that's where I'm going. I decided I'm going to take at least a year, and I'm just going to travel. So I'm going
Yeah.
with my dog, and traveling around this whole country and the U.S., and having a great time. But simultaneously, I'm spending countless hours just discovering, just
Yeah.
learning, and reading about what's going on, and really
Yeah.
trying to uncover, not buying in, like you said, not buying into the narrative of how this world is portrayed by those who control it, but how it actually is operating.
Yeah.
This sort of hidden aspects to it.
And if I can add to that, I'd like people to know, if there's 5 people that watch this or 5,000, who knows, um, that this isn't about, we're not anarchists. We're not people trying to go against, and, oh, like we hate everyone. No, we're just average people that have woken up to go, something isn't adding up here.
Yeah,
Something's wrong. Governments are acting weird. Big organizations are putting strangleholds on things. What the heck's going on? And that just
right.
gets you seeking. And as you start to seek, you start to see there's all of these different things that are tied together. Um, and so, if, as you were saying, this year you're traveling around trying to discover the truth and talk to
Hmm.
people and be in these different cities, and you're seeing a lot of what's going on in the U.S. firsthand right now.
Hmm.
I was doing that last year as trying to do it with my profession. I worked about half time last year, and I don't know how much time I spent on flights. I was going everywhere. I did training under Dr. Brian Weiss under past life regressions. I was going to Law of One conventions. I was going to Dimensions of Disclosure, which talks about everything from UFOs to pedophile rings to the Illuminati and the deep state.
Hmm.
It was everything. And so we're kind of coming at it from different angles, but all of this stuff ties together. And I
Right.
think that's where you and I see in a similar way, is that it's not about what your profession is. It's not about how you were brought up. It's about where we are right now. And where we are right now is at this nexus point
Right.
on planet Earth where something big is happening. And we'll get into some of these possibilities as we're chatting, because some people are looking at this as an ascension process.
Hmm.
Those that are quite spiritual, those that are quite religious are looking at it as a harvest or some sort of end of days prophecy. Others are looking at it as it's all these different ways we can look at it. So as we delve into this, I would like to just throw a whole bunch of things out as we're talking and just see what topics we naturally go into, and just try and stir the pot a bit, try and get
Hmm.
people interested in some of these areas, because everything we talk about today, whether we get into ETs or reincarnation or military industrial complexes, all these different areas we delve into, they're all tied together.
Hmm.
And this is, I think, the hardest thing for some people to understand, is how they're tied together.
Right.
So do you want to
What?
maybe start with that?
Sure. Well, I mean, that's a big thing to start with, but I think
Yeah.
I think the sort of weave that ties it all together is the objective reality. It's not a subjective belief. It's what is the truth. Truth is this
Mhm.
fickle kind of thing that's very difficult to pin down. It's hard to find, and it's something that you can't ever really fully comprehend while we're in this physical form, but it's a unifying objective. And
Mhm.
no matter what angle you come at it, if your goal is the truth, you will always find that sort of unifying perspective to kind of weave into it. And you can go down all sorts of rabbit holes to get there, but all the rabbit holes always lead to the same place. And that's kind of the exciting part about it, and what can be, yeah. Yeah. So I
Mhm.
think, so as far as specifically what where we're at right now and what makes this such an exciting time is all of these aspects that were once considered hearsay and conspiracy theories, as it's often termed, which, you know, that term in and of itself has been weaponized, and it has been weaponized for a very long time to
Mhm.
discredit anyone who's actually using critical thinking and looking into things. I mean, the history of that term in and of itself was, it was invented after JFK was assassinated, and anyone who looked into his death and didn't fully buy into the narrative of what was portrayed by the media at the time, they were automatically labeled as a conspiracy
Mhm.
theorist. And since then, it's been a very successful campaign
Mhm.
to keep and discredit anyone from looking into the truth, because no one really likes to be ridiculed. No one really likes to be ostracized. You know, that's
Mhm.
that fear of being pushed out of the norm.
Mhm.
That kind of keeps people from diving into the truth in that sort of perspective. So that term has been very successful, because anytime anyone steps outside of the status quo and starts to question their reality and starts to question what we're told, if you have people in power and people who have control over the media and how they're portrayed, if they're automatically labeled as a conspiracy theorist, well, then everyone else automatically ridicules them. And you actually have people who are so trained with that topic, with that phrase,
Mhm.
that we self-moderate our own conversations. You
Yeah.
know, people will use that term to discredit and dissuade,
Yeah.
and it's been very successful from that point. But what makes this year so exciting is all of these, you know, things that were previously thought of to be just conspiracy theories are starting to come to light in a big way. And people are still choosing not to look at them in a lot of ways. People are still looking, you know, looking elsewhere and pretending like they don't exist.
Mhm.
But at some point, and it's different for every single person, but at some point everyone comes to that realization. It's like, wow, all of these things that people were talking about, they're starting to come true, and it's all starting to
Mhm.
weave together in this sort of way, which can be really confusing and scary and daunting.
Mhm.
I mean, it has been for me, for sure, but that's where that sort of alignment with truth and right action, and
Mhm.
figuring out where to go with that is such a beneficial practice, because
Yeah, and
yeah.
I like to throw this out too to people that some of this stuff sounds scary. When you start thinking of, when you start delving into this, you see just how corrupt the world is. You start seeing that there seems to be this kind of dark force out there, this manipulative, big business, money grabbing, I, me, mine sort of mentality of living in the world. But there's a lot of light out there too. And
Mhm,
I think a lot of those people that are lighthouses or light workers or whatever you choose to call these people, um, they're the silent majority. They're the silent voices,
mhm,
and they don't get heard, but they're out there. I was one of those for a while. You were one of those for a while, but now we're
mhm,
trying a bit brighter and inform people. So as much as some of this might, and I really want to emphasize this because I don't know how far we are into the recording here. I should have said this right off the start, that I believe is a beautiful overarching narrative around all of this. This seems so dark sometimes, and people can learn these things and just realize, wow, there's so much corruption. And we'll delve into some of this because people need to know some of this. But at the end of the day, I believe this is just a transition. This
mhm,
is just a transition. It's a separation. Some are moving towards what's generally termed service to others, being more compassionate, being more empathic, trying to live a life of love and light more so. Of course, everyone screws up along the way, but that's what's pulling you. And then there are those that are more interested in manipulation, maybe passive aggressiveness, essentially going towards their own agenda, a
Hmm.
self-serving agenda.
Hmm.
And I believe that this right now is just weeding out all of this. And this, what we're seeing in the world right now are just manifestations of this collective consciousness that is separating. It's like oil
Right.
and water, and the oil and water is separating. And so what we're seeing is the disharmony of this separation and the confusion, especially those in the middle that are, as Rob would say, if anyone follows the law of one, that sinkhole of indifference. They're
Hmm.
just indifferent and they don't know what to do. And so I believe there is this like separation happening, and these two sides are really powerful. They're polarized, and it's like a battery. So there's so much energy in here, and this is causing a lot of this manifestation that we're seeing. But what I'd like to do maybe is delve into you just talking a bit around what you see going on right now, because so many people are really curious. We're a bit philosophical here, and so many people are really wanting current time, present day information, up to date information. And so
Hmm.
a lot of people are hunting for what's the new news today, what's the new news tomorrow, and people are really hungry for accurate news that's unbiased and just what's happening in the world right now. So do you want to maybe hit with
Sure.
that a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, just looking at the sort of timeline of this year and up to this point, we've seen n- no one alive, no one alive today has seen anything that's been this world shaking as far as what's happened in this
Mhm.
year. It's been truly unprecedented in what's happened, and it's very confusing from a certain perspective, because the only story that we're told from those that we've traditionally trusted, those sorts of information that claim to tell the truth and tell the news about what's happening, all they do is they push this narrative of fearing. We've got
Mhm.
COVID-19 that's all about, it started out as this unknown, and it's still pushed to some extent as this unknown entity, that's this daunting kind of fearful darkness that is always lurking around the corner, and we're taught to fear our neighbors,
Mhm.
fear going outside, fear, and it's always fear, 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 fear.
Fear, fear, fear. Yeah.
But if you actually boil it down and look at what's actually happening, the data and real events that are transpiring, you can sort of uncover that, and all of that fear starts to dissipate once you do really start looking into it. So, I mean, just going back to when this all began, and we started hearing it trickling in back in January and February, when it was a relatively new concept. It started out as this kind of unknown entity that morphed into this scary monster. If you're believing what everything we're told, it was going to be, I mean, in the US alone, the initial predictions were there were going to be over 2 million deaths in this country, which
Mhm.
is huge. I mean, that's a scary amount of
Mhm.
people, and that's terrifying to even think about it. So
Mhm.
that sort of initial prediction is what led to all of this sort of lockdown panic,
Yeah.
and
And it's
everyone,
almost subconscious programming.
mhm,
Get ready. There's going to be this many deaths. Get ready.
right,
Get
yep,
prepared. And
right.
so it's almost like they set the stage for this to start.
Yes, and that's when you start looking at all of it as a stage, it starts to make a lot more sense from that perspective. And those initial predictions, we went from March to April, and don't get me wrong, there was definitely a virus that was afflicting people, and there were people that were actually dying from it.
Of course.
But
Yeah.
but we weren't actually seeing these predictions coming true. It was not happening at the rate that they initially predicted it. So we went from March to April and then into May with this sort of like more unknown kind of perspective. Is it going to ramp up? Is it going to, and it was constantly said, okay, we're next week it's going to be even worse. Next week it's going to be even worse. And that narrative kept continuing.
Mhm.
But as soon as we got to May, it took that amount of time and enough scientists and enough people who were actually looking at the data and seeing the rates and how things were operating for them to finally change that prediction from 2 million plus deaths in this country down to, because that was initially based on I believe a 5% case fatality rate,
Mm.
um, or maybe fatality rate in general, which is a lot of people.
Mhm.
But then in May, the CDC actually came out with and adjusted their numbers from 5% all the way down to 0.26%, which
Mm-hmm.
is a huge decline. And
Mm-hmm.
there's even room to believe that those numbers were inflated. The 0.26% was much higher than it actually was.
Mm-hmm.
But as soon as that was announced, as soon as this fear started to dissipate from the public consciousness, that's when you had the George Floyd incident. It was right in that same week.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as they released this data, you had a whole nother incident happen where all of a sudden we're shifting from fear to anger, and you have this whole orchestrated event, which
Oh, it's all these clown shows. Look over here, look over
right,
here, look over
eh,
here, look over here. And when this one
right,
isn't working, then they take you over here.
right,
And I think this is probably something we'll get into as well, is that there's been so many distraction and confusion
hmm,
tactics to steer the public to look at things and what is the bigger picture happening
right,
behind the scenes.
right, right. Yeah, I mean it's a constant. If we're always tugged around by our emotions and we're not
Hmm.
allowed to sit and actually think about things, then we're much more easily steered. And I'm not saying that what happened with George Floyd didn't actually happen, but it was just the timing of it is very suspicious. And
Yeah. And,
when you start to dive into it a lot more, it seems to be that it's fitting the same agenda of always keeping people distracted and in a
yeah.
state of lower vibrational state where you're not able to fully comprehend and use
Hmm.
logic to look through things.
I want to show you something here, Justin. I'm going to share this on the screen. It's a CDC site. Where are you here? I've got too many windows open. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, I found this quite interesting, and this is something the public should look up. So CDC site, they're the ones pushing so many narratives right now
Hmm.
and controlling the stats. So when you look at this is case definition for COVID.
Hmm.
Okay, and they put this out there. This is recent. They put this out recently to kind of classify COVID. And so here's the clinical criteria. You have to have at least two of the following symptoms: chills, headaches, taste disorder. Have two of those, or two of these, or two of those.
Mm,
And that's it.
right. Or
So
nothing,
pretty easy criteria for
very
someone to
ambiguous.
label someone as having COVID. Laboratory criteria. Well, that's pretty obvious, but even then, a lot of people are now judging this. How accurate
Hmm.
is this? I've seen a
Hmm.
lot of scientists come forward saying this is not very accurate because it's only looking at part of the DNA strand,
Right.
and it's a small portion of it. And so that DNA could be some other DNA that looks similar to COVID-19. Could
Right.
possibly be another COVID because there are lots of COVIDs out there.
Right.
And then there's the epidemiology side of it, of if someone was close contact and whatever else. These are the things that are being sent over to the CDC to classify COVID and classify if someone has COVID, which is quite fascinating because it
Hmm.
shows just how skewed the stats are. That you can easily be listed as having COVID or a
Hmm.
COVID death when it could have been one of many other things.
Right.
And
Well,
so this might be important for the public just to realize right now that there's such a strong narrative being pushed that is to me it looks a bit desperate and it doesn't make sense, that they're going, look at all of the COVID cases, and this is what you
hmm,
see on the news now. Oh, there's another surge. Oh, there's another surge. Oh, there's another surge. When all they're really doing is testing more, testing with a test that isn't as accurate as it could be. And also, besides that laboratory test, they're doing clinical ratings of what subjectively they think could be clinical terms to say someone looks like they have COVID, and that's classified as COVID. So as these numbers go up and they're higher and higher and higher, and the mortality rate is lower and lower and lower, it actually shows that this is not nearly as lethal as they reported it to be.
no,
But yet they're
no.
steering that as fear. There's all this
Hmm.
fear pouring around, more COVID, more COVID. Actually, what that's showing is that this is not nearly as harmful as we thought. We should be jumping up and down. The media should be going, oh, this is fantastic news. Look at all the COVID we're finding, whether it's accurate or not, and look at the low mortality rates, which are still not accurately diagnosed as I just showed you, if it is a COVID death or not.
Hmm.
So this is even a larger span than we're seeing. So this really isn't that bad of a disease,
Right.
which is
Yeah.
great news, but no one's reporting it as that.
No, there was never a discussion. Well, and what happened in May after the CDC reported that actual um, fatality prediction of 0.26%, the news narrative shifted from reporting on number of deaths to number of cases, as you
Exactly.
mentioned. And that's been the whole narrative since that point, is
Yeah.
just rising cases, rising cases. And then you have, there's a plethora of factors that go into it, and it's hard to really see the whole thing if you don't look at it from a big picture perspective. But each factor that's considered and what's put forward by the quote unquote news that goes out there, all of those are specifically selectively chosen, cherry picked to introduce fear. And all of the factors that could reduce the fear are completely ignored. All the things that could be put forward that would reduce the amount of fear that people see,
Hmm.
they're shunned, they're censored, they're pushed away, and
Hmm.
and and that introduces a whole host of other problems. But I mean,
Justin,
specific.
let me ask you this. Sorry,
Sure.
no, cut you off.
Oh, well, I was just going to say specifically, another huge fear factor that's put out there is this whole mask conversation as well.
Mm.
We went from the very beginning where you had these same quote unquote experts that are on the television saying that don't wear masks, they're not effective.
Hmm.
Nobody needs to. We need to save them for the hospital staff and
Hmm.
blah blah blah. It was very very across the board that masks were not a very effective uh, measure. But then same timeline, as soon as May comes around, they flip the script and they're
Hmm.
like, oh, everyone needs to wear masks, and it's all these mandatory measures were put in place where people needed to wear them in stores, and so that became this physical symbol that represented that fear, when the science behind the masks are largely, it's so contradictory
Hmm.
at best. But if you actually look at the studies behind them, I mean, there has still to this day not been a single randomized controlled trial, peer-reviewed study that showed an efficacy of mask in combating viral spread. In
I
fact, they've
agree.
shown the opposite. But the masks were just used as this sort of easy way to continue driving that fear into people's, because if you've got it, you walk outside and you see all these people wearing masks. Well, if you haven't done your research and looked into what's behind this thing, that's going to be a real physical reminder of, like, oh, I need to be afraid of this.
Hmm.
And so that's just one sort of compounding factor of how this fear narrative has been maintained throughout all of this. And
Show you
it's not.
something here. I'll share this screen now. Um, can you see that? It's my Facebook page.
Yeah.
Okay, so um, here's some documents that I put on my Facebook page. So this one, you actually sent me this. Okay, this is something. Um, this website here. This is something that people should look up.
Hmm.
So here's a video. You can see the. Let me pause this. Okay, so this was really informative, really well done video. And then it gets into below here showing the research, and they list the journals and whatnot.
Right.
Getting in here to show the research on the masks, which is probably why a few months ago, they were saying masks don't help, right?
Hmm.
Probably because they were looking at this research at the time, which is still the best research out there. So for an example, I went to this BMJ one, and I actually looked at this article to see if the video was talking about it accurately. And this is a legit journal. People know BMJ, and you can go here and you can read this. You can look at it. You can just read the conclusions, which sometimes people have to read more than that. But when you get into this, it is pretty clear that what they're showing is that masks don't work. And the history around masks is quite interesting itself.
Hmm.
And I think one of the best conclusions around this is that they actually found that if people were wearing a cloth mask versus no mask, people that wore a cloth mask actually got more infections,
Yep.
because the cloth mask gets moist and turns into kind of like a petri dish.
Right.
At the end of the day, people are steering this narrative out there. And I think I was almost saying this when it first came out too, that, masks aren't going to filter the virus. It's going to help you not spread it. So a lot of people right now are on this kick I don't know if this is across the US too, but a lot of people in Canada are saying, don't be a spreader, wear a mask.
Hmm. Yep.
But people have to look and use their critical thinking skills here. If a mask is shown, and these studies show this, that a virus is too small and a virus comes through the mask to you, why would you not be spreading it if you're wearing a mask and it goes back out?
Right.
This is not a one-way valve. So there's this false narrative that these masks are going to help you from not spreading. And some people are talking about because it's in moisture and the moisture pellets are stopped. Maybe some of them, but this is also a mask that you're pushing air through. I was a
Right.
firefighter for 10 years and we use positive pressure ventilation all the time. This is positive pressure pushing out. So
Hmm.
everyone's pushing air through. There has to be a transfer of air, otherwise you're not breathing. And
Right.
viruses are so small, they're going through this. So in my perspective, a mask is really a catch for, it's like a catcher's mitt for pieces of food, big particles of things, water droplets, sure, but it's not going to stop a virus. And
Mm-mm.
these masks actually say right on there that they don't stop COVID.
Right. Yeah, especially and that's where it gets so I mean, in my opinion, ridiculous because if they actually worked, we would we would have these government agencies coming out and saying, okay, we need to wear a mask and these types of masks do work. These types of masks actually work. Here's the studies behind them. These types of masks don't work. Here's the studies behind them. But instead
Yeah,
we have this just general blanket mandate of everyone needs to wear something. It doesn't matter what it is. Put a t-shirt over your face, like it doesn't
yeah,
matter. And
exactly.
and that just kind of further emphasizes that they're not used from an effectiveness standpoint of combating viral spread. It's used as a physical symbol of implementing fear and if we're boiling down, it's essentially a mind control aspect.
Hmm.
It's a way to control the narrative, keep the fear up and you're showing here right here there's countless amount of articles and studies and scientific journals and peer-reviewed randomized control trials that all show that at best they do absolutely nothing, and like you mentioned, at worst they introduce more complications of
Hmm.
holding essentially a petri dish of infection to your face. People are constantly touching their face and adjusting things. So you're
Yeah.
introducing a whole host of other issues that could be avoided if we just drop the mask.
And I'd like to educate people, and I don't say this with any sort of condescending tone or anything, but you and I saw this recently on Facebook where this was posted and someone came up kind of showing their own research from a Google search. And then afterwards said, oh, I could have done DuckDuckGo for a search and I could have provided that too,
Mhm.
challenging this information here. And I want to just let people know, those that aren't used to research, that um, the long and short of research like this is that something like the BMJ here is going to be a peer-reviewed journal. And so in short, what that means is that people that want to publish in a specific journal, whether it's in my field, psychology, in this field, something else, someone has to be doing a study that they've written up and they're going to present to this journal that publishes it in their journal that contains that source of information. And then there is a board that has experts that are in the field as well, and they will vet this material coming in to see if it's worth publicating inside their journal. Some of the vetting processes are a little suspect sometimes, depending who's on the board and if they have their fingers in other pies, which we're starting to see. But generally speaking, that's kind of how it's been done. Unless it's peer reviewed, which means peers in that field are reviewing the information coming in before it's publicated. That's what these are. So when someone's looking at a Google search or a DuckDuckGo search or whatever else, they're pulling up everything. The healthcare field often talks about Dr. Google because everyone goes on Google for information.
Mhm.
Google will put anything out there. So I think people have to understand that there is different
Well,
levels of research that you can get.
yeah, and I would clarify on that too, that people underestimate how deep this sort of social conditioning of information goes, because Google is very much a part of that. All of these search engines are only going to put forward the most sort of advertised quote unquote data that's going to show a specific
They're a
narrative.
business.
right. They're a
They're a
business,
business.
and
Yeah.
they're paid to put forward what these same, you know, news organizations put forward as well, and it's all to introduce this level of fear without actually putting real information. So yeah, and so, you know, we continue going down the line, and what, we're in August now, and anyone can find the peak death count. The peak death rate was back in April, and we're in August now, and holistically, the deaths have been declining since that point. But yet we've seen all of these different narratives put forward, of the mass narrative and the case narrative and all these different things that are only specifically designed to introduce more fear and keep that narrative going.
Hmm.
And if you don't really, if you're not really willing to engage with the why behind that, well,